Good afternoon. It's my esteemed pleasure to introduce Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack. When we think about a leader, we think about a person who we would strive to emulate, imitate. And when you think about the United States Department of Agriculture, President Lincoln referred to it as the People's Agency. And I'm so happy that President Barack Obama selected a people's person to lead the People's Agency. When you reflect after reading his bio, you'll see all of the wonderful things that the Secretary has done and all of the things that he is yet to do. And I'm reminded of a quote from Booker T. Washington that says, "Success is to be measured not so much by the position that one has reached in one's life as by the obstacles which he has overcome." Ladies and gentlemen, please rise as we greet the 30th Secretary of Agriculture, United States of America, Secretary Tom Vilsack.
Thank you, folks. Thank you, please. Thank you. Thank you, folks. Thank you. Delbert, thank you very, very much. I honestly am really happy to be here this morning because I want to start with just an extraordinary thank you to the folks who are here. I think Extension is one of the great marvels of the U.S., of agriculture, of rural America, of land-grant universities, and of higher education generally. As I travel around the world, I am always impressed when I go to developing countries. There is great desire for learning in those developing countries. They're very interested in replicating what we have done here with American agriculture. But invariably, the conversation always returns to the need to replicate, to duplicate extension. I think folks around the world understand and appreciate how extraordinary it is that whatever happens in a laboratory, on a college campus, a university campus, in agribusiness, wherever progress is being made, that it doesn't work unless people find out about it and unless people learn about it. And as we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Extension service, I think all of you connected to Extension are connected to a tradition of connecting people to information they need. And what an amazing, extraordinary job you've done in making that connection when you see how much progress has taken place in the countryside in this country in terms of agriculture. I was just visiting with folks at CoBank, which is a large lending institution, and we were talking about the extraordinary efficiency of American agriculture. We were talking about some of the challenges that American agriculture faces. And I thought how appropriate it was for me to follow that conversation, coming in, speaking to folks connected to and celebrating the heritage of Extension. Because you're the folks who are actually going to make sure that we continue this great story of American agriculture. You know, in 1930, there were roughly 6.5 million Americans who were engaged actively in agriculture, and most of what we did back in the 1930s was of a subsistence nature. Folks, basically, if they didn't grow it, they didn't survive, they didn't eat. Through the extraordinary work of our university system and extension, agribusinesses and farmers, we are now at a point where 50% of what is grown and raised in this country is generated by 33,000 farming operations. I've heard statistics from China recently, and they are varied. I've read 60 million, I've read 100 million, I've read 400 million farmers in that great country, and they are not anywhere near able to produce enough food for their people. But 33,000 farming operations in this country produce 50% of what we grow. If you want to extend that to the bulk of what we grow, the majority of what we grow, 85% or so of what we grow, you're talking 200,000 families, farming operations. That's 1/10 of 1% of the population of the country. And the only way that they've been able to create this great efficiency is because they've had information. They've had access to knowledge. And one of the principal ways they've been able to obtain that is through extension. Now extension has another great challenge before it. With the passage of every new farm bill, we always put the burden on extension and the land-grant university system to assist us and help us in explaining to the countryside what the new farm bill provides. And in many cases, for the last 10, 15, 20 years, it's been pretty much consistent, not a great deal of change until this year. And now we are faced with a fundamentally different farm bill, a fundamentally different safety net for our producers. Now, no longer direct payments. In its place, a revenue protection program, a price loss protection, profit loss protection program, which the land-grant universities will help assist us in putting together the educational materials and then getting the information out through extension as to exactly what is involved with these programs, as farmers have to make a critically important election at the end of this year for their operation that will govern their operation not just for this year and for next year, but for the length of this farm bill, and I suspect for years to come. So an extraordinarily important responsibility. And no one in our shop is doubting the ability of extension to get the job done. So that is a challenge. You're also engaged in an effort, along with land-grant universities, to try to address another challenge that we face in agriculture of not just learning about new programs, but who actually will be the farmers of the future. There are 7 times the number of farmers over the age of 65 in this country today than there are farmers under the age of 35. I really wasn't very good at math, but I'm good enough to know that's not a good trend line. And I think it's important and relevant for us to begin having a very serious conversation, and I think that has begun, as to exactly who will be the farmer of the future and what will he or she look like and be like, and what will they do on their farming operation. And again, it will be extension that assists us in making sure that first and foremost, folks understand and appreciate what getting into the farming business means and what programs are available to assist that beginning farmer to be more successful than they might otherwise be on their own. And then how do they develop that relationship with extension to make sure that they continue to get the information they need. And this farm bill creates new opportunities for beginning farmers. A new opportunity in credit, an extension of the microloan program, an opportunity for crop insurance to be more affordable to beginning farmers, the ability to receive advanced payments in certain conservation programs for beginning farmers, the ability to work with beginning farmer development programs and with veterans organizations to make the case to these returning veterans who want to come back home and want to live and work and raise their families in the communities where they came from, the opportunity to do that in the agriculture business. And we know that those who have suffered through the horrors of war come back a little different than when they left, and oftentimes they have a hard time adjusting to the circumstances of everyday life here back home when they have seen what they have seen and been through what they've been through. That ability to connect these returning veterans to the land, the ability for them to grow, to nourish something, is not only good for them economically, it's good for their soul. And their ability to do that will be in very large part dependent on your capacity to get information out and to assist and help them. So that's a serious job that you all have. And then there is the challenge of a changing climate. We have recently established at U.S.D.A. A series of climate change hubs, which are a partnership between our great research facilities at ARS, our great folks who work at the Forest Service, and our great folks who work at NRCS, and connected to universities, in an effort to do an assessment of exactly how this changing climate is impacting and affecting agriculture. Make no mistake, we can have a debate, I suppose, as to what's causing all of this, but there is no debate that the world is getting a little warmer in a lot of places, and that is having an impact on growing seasons. It's having an impact on the length and intensity of certain weather patterns like drought, snowstorms, hurricanes, tornadoes. It is clearly having an impact on pests and diseases that might not have survived through more difficult winters, but do today, and the impact that that has on our trees, our forests, and our crops. And so it's going to be important for us to have a clear understanding of the vulnerabilities in each region of the country, to assess what those vulnerabilities are, and then to figure out, well, what is the strategy for adapting or mitigating the consequences of this changing climate. And without extension, that might be where the story ends. And if the story ended there, we would not have the capacity to say America is a food secure nation. We would not be in the position we are in today with this extraordinarily productive agriculture, because we would see less and less productivity over time. But that's where you all come in. You are that link between that assessment and the ability of farmers to adapt and to mitigate the consequences of a changing climate. Without extension, we don't necessarily be as successful in getting the information out to producers in a way that they can use, because you speak the language. You have the trust and faith of those producers. So when you tell them that there is a cover crop they can use, or there is a second crop they can grow, or there's a nutrient management plan they could put in place, or there is an irrigation system they can improve, they listen to you. They trust you. They have faith in the information you provide. Why? Because for the last 100 years, you all have been doing an extraordinary job of giving people the information that has allowed them to prosper. So now you're called upon in a very critical time for American agriculture to once again provide that valuable role. And I understand, as a former governor and as a secretary of a department who now struggles mightily with tight budgets, how hard that must be, because it's not as if there is an overflowing of resources coming to extension. There is the challenge that every state governor, every land grant president has placed on extension to continue to do more with less. So I understand and appreciate how challenging the fiscal situation is for extension. But I also know that you all are adapting, you are changing with the times, and you're going to provide that information that's going to allow American agriculture to continue to succeed. You have another important responsibility, as if making sure that we have farmers in the future and making sure we can grow things in the future isn't enough, and making sure that people understand this complicated farm bill, which is, Kathy, how many pages is the farm bill? Hundreds of pages. It's a quiz, Kathy. And if I were a professor, I'd give you a B. Sonny, how many pages is the farm bill? B minus. You were looking at her paper. No, it's over 390 pages long in very small print. Requires us at U.S.D.A. to take 450 separate actions to implement. So we understand how complicated this is, how difficult it is. But you've got another responsibility. You have a responsibility to a larger audience even beyond American agriculture, and that is to folks who live, work, and raise their families in rural areas. You know, whenever I think of extension, even in my current capacity, I'm drawn back to the time when I was practicing law in a small town in Iowa, in Mount Pleasant. And our extension office was in the corner of Jefferson and Monroe Street. It's an old bank building. And I walked in there one day, and I was representing a woman who was unfortunately involved in a dissolution of marriage proceeding. And she had been a homemaker all of her life, had raised a couple of kids. And as I remember, her husband was a business leader, and he was not very happy about this whole situation from a financial perspective, and was not particularly interested in being generous, despite the fact that they had been married for many, many years. And I was trying to figure out, is there a way in which I could place a value, an economic value, on the extraordinary work this woman had done in being a homemaker. I had no idea where to turn for that kind of information. So I happened to be walking by the extension office one day, and I sort of walked in, and there they had, you all put these little white papers together. Iowa State Extension, white paper. The value of homemaker. It's like, this is great. And so I went over and I picked it up, and it had, you know, if you really stop and think about what people do at home, I mean, she was a chauffeur because she got the kids to school and picked them up. She was a cook, a chef. She was a laundress. She was a person who was a cleaner. She kept the books at the house. You know, she had all of these tasks, and each one of them was broken down by extension, and a dollar value was assessed, and it was pretty significant by the time you total it all up. It was equal to what he was making. And so I brought the extension person on. She testified she was great, and we got a good outcome. So I've always had a soft spot for extension. But now you're called upon to do a really challenging thing. Rural America is challenged. And it's challenged in part because of the success of agriculture. I mean, if only 33,000 farming operations do 50% of the work and 200,000 farming operations do 85% of the work, that means there are fewer people doing the work, which means there are fewer people living and working on the farm, which means that those small towns that have been dependent in the past on all these farmers continuing to come into town and buying at the local implement dealership and buying at the car dealership and buying at the local bakery and so forth, all those potential customers are gone. And we haven't until recently overlaid an economy that takes full advantage of the natural resource advantage that rural America has. And so these rural communities are challenged. They're challenged because wage levels are fundamentally different than what folks who work in cities and suburbs make. They're challenged because there aren't as many opportunities in agriculture as there once were. They're challenged because the poverty that they experience is persistent and deep and often not fully appreciated and recognized. When we talk about poverty in this country, we have a tendency to think about it. The writers, the rest seems to think about it in terms of inner city poverty. But the reality is the vast majority of counties that are persistently poor are located in rural areas. So there's a challenge there. And this recovery, we've had 50 consecutive months of job growth in this country, and that's great. 9.2 million additional jobs. The unemployment rate's coming down. The deficit's coming down at dramatic rates. Healthcare costs are slowing down. But not all of that translates to rural folks. And that's where you all come in. And that's where we, in partnership, will work with you to revitalize, to reform, to change, to transform the rural economy. And the biggest challenge we have is that the folks we're working with and working for are tough and resilient. They hang on better than anybody else in the world. They're tenacious in their capacity to hang on. The problem with that is it makes it harder for them to transform and to change. And so we have to figure out the very difficult equation of how you can hang on and be resilient, but also transform at the same time. And I think that's possible, but it won't be easy. And it's going to require great connection between Extension and U.S.D.A. So here's the strategy, and here's how we need your help. Whatever the rural economy is, has been, and will always be natural resource based. I mean, if you think about it, the future, the past of rural America has been farming and some of the other things, the minerals, extraction. And that's what has been sort of the key to the rural economy. Well, as all of those industries have become more efficient, as we've had a global economy and the challenges that creates, as agriculture becomes more efficient, those old ways of doing business have become limited. So how do you create a natural resource economy that doesn't jeopardize the capacity of production agriculture to continue doing what it does so well, but at the same time expand opportunity? Well, you first of all make a commitment to production agriculture and the export opportunities it creates by continuing to do what we're doing, get the Farm Bill, get the safety net programs, get the information out, evaluate what the vulnerabilities are with climate change, get that information out, for sure. Got to do that. But let's complement that economy. Let's go one step further. Let's say to those medium and small-sized operators who struggle in this economy as farmers, we want to create new market opportunities for you. We don't necessarily want you to only have to compete in a commodity market where you're put at a disadvantage versus that larger guy who's more efficient, who can produce more quality and more quantity. You can't fairly compete against that guy. Let's give you another opportunity. Let's give you a different market. Let's give you a local market. Let's give you a regional market. Let's give you the ability to deal with somebody you know by name. And when you do that, you create a relationship, and that relationship is of value to your customer, and that customer is willing to pay you just a little bit more for whatever it is you grow because he or she trusts you. He or she knows that your kids go to the same school that their children go to or their grandchildren go to, and they know and understand that you're contributing to the community, and they're willing to do that. Let's create a local and regional food system that supports those small and medium-sized operators. Today we're announcing $78 million of resource available at U.S.D.A. for the development of those markets, whether it's a farmer's market promotion grant, or whether it's a local food promotion grant, $15 million in each one of those buckets. We're also revising our business and industry loan program, creating $48 million of availability of loan guarantees that can help that food hub generate and locate in a rural area, allow an aggregation of that locally and regionally produced food. Those food hubs employ people, creates jobs, adds value, creates additional customer base. And each one of those food hubs can be a multi-million-dollar business that can be located in a small town. You know, small towns I come from that I travel in, you employ 20, 25, 30 people, pretty decent jobs. That's a good thing. That helps to revitalize that rural economy. You provide an opportunity for that small and medium-sized producer to have a market that allows them to actually make a living from what they do. That's going to keep them on the farm, and it's going to keep those farms going. Let's complement that with a different attitude about conservation. It isn't just conservation for the sake of better soil and better air and better water quality, all of which are important and all of which we have to do. But let's figure out how we can quantify, measure, verify those conservation results, and then let's take that information to regulated industries, be they a utility company or a water treatment facility, and say, could you get the benefit that you are required to get from gray infrastructure that you have to build, you have to maintain, and you have to spend a lot of money on? Can you get that same environmental benefit? Can you comply with that regulation in the same way by investing in land conservation? Can you create a new income source for that landowner? Can you create new opportunities for that small contracting firm that does the conservation work that allows you to get that economic benefit? And in doing so, can you create an ecosystem market that's local or regional in size? Let's figure out how to do a better job of connecting the habitat opportunities that conservation creates to outdoor recreation, which is a multi-$100 billion opportunity that we need to take better advantage of in rural areas. Now let's complement that conservation effort with what we'll be announcing at the end of this month, which is the Regional Conservation Partnership opportunity. We're going to designate some critically important areas in conservation in this country, larger landscape scale sized projects, and then we're going to reach out to foundations, we're going to reach out to Pheasants Forever and reach out to folks who are concerned, Ducks Unlimited, sportsmen's groups. We're going to say, hey, how about investing in conservation in these critically important areas? Let's create job opportunities. Let's create more income opportunities for landowners. Let's bring vitality back into these rural areas based on conservation. It's a $2 billion opportunity over the next 10 years to leverage $2 billion of federal resource to hopefully hundreds of millions and billions of dollars of additional investment. Let's complement that, production, agriculture, and exports, local and regional food systems, conservation, outdoor recreation, ecosystem markets, with the new opportunity the Farm Bill creates of bioproduct manufacturing. The ability to take what we grow and what we raise and every aspect of it and create greater value. Let's not have that producer just simply have to sell their product on a commodity market. Let's create an ingredient market. Let's take that crop residue. Let's take that livestock waste. Let's make it an ingredient not just in the production of food or fuel or feed or fiber, but let's create it as a feedstock for a chemical, for a polymer, for some other material. Let's move away from our over-reliance on fossil fuels relative to these chemicals and materials, and let's create greater balance in our economy. And in doing so, create new opportunities in rural areas, better advantage of our natural resource base, more efficient use of what we grow and raise, better effective use of the input costs that are going into every farming operation, higher returns, more jobs, processing jobs, manufacturing jobs in rural areas. Again, these processing facilities, you can't have one facility like an oil refinery that's going to focus on a good part of the country. You're going to have these facilities all across the rural landscape. This can now happen because we have in the energy title of the Farm Bill the capacity to use our resources at U.S.D.A. to help sponsor, to help fund, to help support these biochemical, biomaterial, bioprocessing facilities. They'll employ 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 people. They'll employ folks to build them and maintain them. It's a whole new opportunity. But none of this works unless Extension can help us articulate the need for folks not just to hang on, but to be willing to transform, to be willing to accept these new opportunities, to jump in with both feet in local and regional food systems, to look at conservation differently, to understand the bioprocessing future of this country. You all are so critically important to that. So you're going to help us maintain our farming population. You're going to make sure we continue to be a food secure nation, and you're going to revitalize the rural economy. I think that's about enough. Let me just conclude with why this is so important. You all know this. Many of you probably come from these small towns. But rural America is just incredibly important to this country and incredibly underappreciated. Some people may understand it's where most of our food comes from. They may get that, maybe. They probably don't understand how much of the water that we consume is impacted by what happens in our agricultural and forested lands. They may not appreciate that 3/4 of the land mass of the United States is either in agricultural production or in forestry. They may not think about the fact that most of what allows us to turn on the lights and turn on the car that's domestically produced comes from rural areas. They may not even think about the fact that to get away from it all, they end up going to a rural area. And they clearly don't appreciate that in disproportionate numbers, small town families send their sons and daughters to the military. And in this last decade, that has been a huge sacrifice. Why do they do that? What is it about living in a small town makes kids want to give something back to their country? I've got a 21-year-old nephew, Sam Bell. Sam was a B student in high school. A couple of extracurricular activities. I'm pretty sure he could have gone to some really good universities. I'm pretty sure he could have gotten into the University of Iowa. Pretty sure he could have gotten into Iowa State University, maybe Northern Iowa. Could have gotten into some of the small colleges that populate my state. But Sam chose not to do that. He chose to go into the Marines. He chose to enlist, and he enlisted, and he found himself at age 19 in Afghanistan. And he found himself one day in a Humvee that was blown up. Sam survived with just a concussion and a little hearing loss. But one of his buddies lost a leg. And why did Sam Bell do that? Why do people like Sam Bell from small towns go into the service? Well, they go in because, I believe, they're raised in an area, in a town, in a place, surrounded by people who understand something very basic, which is if there is something that gives to you, that contributes to your life, that allows you to live the life that you live, that you have got to give something back to it so that it can continue to provide for you. Farmers understand that that's what the land does. They don't keep taking from the land, because they know that eventually the land will say, that's all we're going to give you. They have to replenish it. They have to give something back. They have to put something back into the land. And then they do it. And they do it because they appreciate the land. They understand they have a stewardship responsibility to that land that has given them so much. That value system pervades everything that happens in a small town. That's why small towns are so community-oriented, because people understand they got to give back because they're getting something in return, something really valuable, a connection. So kids grow up with that, and they look around, they go, geez, this country I live in, pretty neat place. I can be whatever I want to be. I have access to great education. I get 3 meals a day. I get a pretty decent public education. I get to travel. I get to have freedoms and securities. I can speak my mind. I get all of this. Creates a responsibility to give something back. And if we don't do a better job of caring for rural America, it'll stop giving to us. It's that simple. And that's why you're so important, because you're going to give us the capacity to get the message out to the folks who will be able to transform and still hang on. They'll be able to grow. They'll be able to expand. They'll be able to think differently. And they'll understand and appreciate that it's not as challenging and difficult a life as they may have thought, that there's real opportunity, and they may convey that positive, optimistic, hopeful message to their children. And their children will see those opportunities, and they'll want to stay, and they'll want to come back, because their children understand they had a pretty good life when they were growing up in that small town. So that's the work that you're doing. That's how important it is. So let me end where I started, with just a simple thank you for the work that you all have done and for what your predecessors have done over the last 100 years. You continue to make a difference, and I can't think of a more important time for extension than now, given the challenges we face and the opportunities we have. Thank you all very much.
Secretary Vilsack will take a couple questions if somebody has one to ask. Don't be shy. Huh? Yeah, Doug?
I'll repeat it.
I'm Director of Texas Agricultural Extension Service. You mentioned during your presentation at APLU about capacity funds and your understanding the issues there. A lot of what you mentioned now are formula or capacity funds allow us to do that. Mm-hmm. And I know those are decisions we have to make, but the strength of our system is only as good as the support we get from U.S.D.A. And recommendations right is on how we continue to strengthen and grow capacity funds.
The question for folks who may not have heard it in the back has to do with capacity funds and the important role that they play in allowing you all to do the job that I just outlined needs to be done, and whether or not there are strategies for continuing to encourage U.S.D.A. To support capacity funds and ways in which those capacity funds can be maintained and increased. Fair articulation of the question. Well, first of all, it's not just our decision on capacity funds. There are 435 people in the House of Representatives and 100 people in the Senate that have something to say about this. And they have created a very difficult circumstance for us because they have passed a thing called sequester. Now, last year or so, that hasn't been a problem because they've basically allowed us a little flexibility with reference to sequester, but next year, in 2016, the budget that we'll be working on soon, sequester comes back, and with that could be a significant across-the-board reduction again. When we had sequester in place, USDA was required to cut its budget by 5.2%, and then on top of that, Congress felt that we had such largesse that they put an additional $2 2.3% additional cut on top of the 5.2%. So at this point in time, USDA's operating budget, the budget that funds a lot of our programs, is $1 billion less than when I became secretary. Now, our team at USDA has done an extraordinary job of really focusing on efficiencies so that we haven't had as much of a program impact as we might have had if we'd been like a lot of other departments and basically just waited for the other shoe to drop. We engaged in a thing called Blueprint for Stronger Service, and we've identified over $1 billion of efficiencies and savings. Not easy to do, fewer workers, about 5,000 fewer FTEs, some real sacrifices that have been made. And we're now continuing to squeeze out as much savings as we can, but it's not easy. So first and foremost, in response to your question, if we didn't have to deal with sequester, that would make things a bit easier. Because what sequester does, it creates an overall cap on discretionary spending. And then within that cap, Congress has to determine its priorities. And there are some folks who believe that Defense Department shouldn't be cut as much, and Veterans Affairs needs additional resources because of all these returning vets, and you can't fault that thought. And so therefore you got challenges. Now, the second issue that we confront with our budget, beyond sequester, is that there are certain aspects of our discretionary budget that impact our capacity to do what you would like us to do. 50% of USDA's budget on the discretionary side is just in 4 lines, 4 items, 50%. It's fire suppression, our Forest Service. It's rental assistance for 285,000 people who live in rural areas that just flat out can't afford to pay full rent because of their difficult financial circumstances. It's the WIC program, which is the Women and Infant Children Nutrition Program. And it's food safety, the responsibilities we have in meat, poultry, and processed eggs. When sequester gets hit, when we get hit with sequester, Congress basically said, we don't really want you to reduce these line items. We actually want to increase fire suppression. We want to increase WIC. We want to increase or maintain rental assistance and food safety, which meant that this other 50% over here had to bear not just its expense and its cuts, but this other 50%'s increase and cut. So it's really hard, okay, to fit all the pieces together. So first and foremost, a little relaxation on sequester. But the deficit's coming down at a dramatic rate, fastest rate that's come down in probably 20 years. We cut the deficit in half. So maybe the urgency is not quite what it was 2 or 3 years ago because of the steps that have been taken. And then secondly, we're asking Congress to give us a little different way to fund fire suppression, for example, which could take some pressure off other parts of the budget. And then I think it is continuing to make the case for continued investment in the overall system. And Kathy Wotecki, Sonny have done a terrific job of educating us on the importance of investing in that mission area of USDA. It's never anywhere near as much as Kathy and Sonny want. They're never happy. But it's better than it was. The other thing that I think will help in this area is the establishment of the Research Foundation and continued support for NIFA. I know that's not the area, but it's important for NIFA and the competitive grants to continue to receive assistance as well, because we have these huge needs. Kathy prepared a paper recently, Kathy and her team prepared a paper recently on agricultural research, which I read. And it's interesting to read because $13 billion is spent on ag research a year, a little over $8 billion is spent on the private sector, and the other is spent from us, and it's not anywhere near enough, given the challenges that agriculture faces of feeding billions of people and weather patterns that are changing and so forth. So it's going to be important for us to make the case to beef up REE overall, which will allow us to do a better job of supporting the capacity grants, at the same time supporting continued research. And this research foundation gives us another tool. The Farm Bill creates it. It won't be run by us. It'll be run by a 15-person board that we select at U.S.D.A., but then they will basically be a separate and distinct entity, if you will. And we are putting $200 million from the Farm Bill in that, and it has to be matched by at least $200 million from some other source other than the federal government. So that means $400 million. Well, that's in our world, that's a pretty good chunk of change. And we hope if we're successful with that it perpetuates itself, that it allows additional federal support, but even more importantly, that it does such great research that the private sector and the foundations and all those folks see the value of it, and they basically begin taking some of the pressure, which has been solely placed on REE, some of the pressure off REE so that we can think about other areas of responsibility and maybe do a better job of supporting them. So that's a long answer to your question, but I think it gives you a sense of the challenge that sequester creates, the challenge that our budget creates, but we think there are opportunities in the future to maybe take some of the pressure off aspects of our budget, and if we could get Congress to basically understand that sequester is not really the right way to approach this, that a growing economy and a tax policy that makes sense and is reasonable, that closes some of these loopholes that nobody understands why they're there, is a better way to do it. We'll see how that goes.
Any other burning questions?
Burning questions. Oh, yes, sir. Well, that's a good question, and I think the phase-in of the facility in Ohio is just that. It's going to take a couple of years to totally phase in its participation in programs. So in the short term, I don't see that there's necessarily a challenge, but I think it goes back to the question that was asked here, which is you're actually saying to me in a very polite way, you need to put more resources in this. And we recognize the responsibility that we have to all the land grant, all systems. But it is, at the end of the day, it's dollars and cents. And sometimes we do propose additional resources, as we have in the past, and Congress has a different set of priorities. And that's a problem. That's an issue. Now, you've got a great champion in Ohio, Congresswoman Fudge, who is not only proud of getting that in the Farm Bill and responsible, I think, in large part for it happening, but she is also a big proponent of that. And I will tell you that some of the pressure that this budget has faced on the non-discretionary side may have an opportunity for us to get a little more flexibility. Now, for example, we had the Farm Bill. In the Farm Bill, we had this huge debate over the SNAP program. So many people just don't understand who actually gets SNAP. They think it's, I don't know, they think it's somebody who's gaming the system, somebody who's not working very hard, doesn't want a job, just sort of living off the fat of the land, so to speak. It's really not that. It's senior citizens, people with disabilities, kids, working men and women. That's roughly 3/4 of the folks receiving SNAP, and then you put veterans in that equation, returning veterans who are having a hard time adjusting. Only 8% of SNAP beneficiaries receive welfare, cash welfare. Only 8%, 92% do not. That's completely not what a lot of people think. So they attempted to cut SNAP. At the end of the day, they realized that the best way to reduce the SNAP rolls is to get people to work and give them an opportunity. And they created an opportunity for us to do that, and we're looking forward to those pilots. But the SNAP numbers have recently been recalibrated by Congress, and it appears as if we're actually going to cut $24 billion out of that program without anybody losing their capacity to participate. And so as the economy improves, as unemployment comes down, as we do a better job of dealing with the long-term unemployed, that can help. Now here's another thing that could help your cause. Now you may not even think about this. You may think I'm crazy when I say this, but bear me out. Immigration reform. How could that possibly make a difference to extension and land-grant universities? Well, here's how. When you have comprehensive immigration reform, you grow the economy. Every economist that's looked at this has concluded that GDP will expand with comprehensive immigration reform. The Congressional Budget Office says that with comprehensive immigration reform, the budget deficit will be reduced by $850 billion over 20 years, without anybody's taxes being increased or anybody's services being cut. You give me $850 billion of relief on the deficit side, that's going to make me a little bit more comfortable about increasing certain aspects of the federal budget. It also will shore up the Social Security system. It will actually extend its life. It will provide a historic investment in border security, and oh, by the way, it will allow agriculture to fully operate at maximum potential, because now people are not growing what they are capable of growing and not harvesting what they're in fact planting, because they simply don't have enough hands to do the work. It's an outrageous situation, in my view, that we allow this to happen when all of the benefits will accrue to the economy, to Social Security, to border security, and to agriculture, and on top of that, evangelical faith-based leaders, progressive faith-based leaders all see the moral calling of this and have called upon Congress to get this done. So something like that, which you may not even think about, and you ask, what can you do? You pass immigration reform, you reduce the deficit, you grow the economy, you're going to reduce SNAP numbers, you're going to take pressure off those assistance programs, you're going to create more capacity within the federal budget, because you're not spending as much on assistance, because you got more people working, you got more tax-paying folks, taxes coming in, you all of a sudden have a little extra cash to put into the formula, into competitive grants, into land-grant universities that have been starved for resources for far too long. You have those capacities. So it's all sort of connected. It's all sort of connected. And you have, because of your position, because of how valued you are in your communities, you have a disproportionate capacity to impact debates like this by using your voice, by letting folks know, and by making the connection for policymakers that there is a connection between something as seemingly remote as comprehensive immigration reform and the formula funding for land-grant universities. Thank you all very much.
Okay, before we break for lunch, we have a nice little video message, and I want you to do a little game with me. This person that's going to be in the video message was a 4-H'er. He is a farmer. He is a public servant, and he is 89 years old. And I would like to thank the University of Georgia for helping get this produced through Fine Line Productions. So, does anybody guess who it might be? Yay! All right, can you roll the video, please?
Well, I lived on a farm until I went off to be in the Navy and to go to college. And my father was a very fine and aggressive farmer. And of course, the source of our advice when Daddy wanted to do something better or learn about a new species of peanut or cotton or corn was to go to the Extension Service. And they gave him whatever advice he needed. And it was just like a constant source of inspiration and advice and counsel, and sometimes correction when he was doing something wrong. And as I grew older and when I came back from the Navy and spent the next 17 years as a full-time farmer, I saw firsthand the great value of what the Extension Service offered to everyone in our county, not just farmers, but everybody in the merchants and others who did business with farmers and depended on agricultural income. An increasingly important element of Georgia's and America's total production of food will have to be designed toward meeting the needs of our own country and other nations more than it has been in the past. So I think the gamut of influence of Extension Service I don't think has been minimized in recent modern days, but I think the opportunities to expand their influence has been greatly increased now and I believe in the future. In all the ways that I had an early developmental life in earning a living and learning how to live as a productive citizen, I would say the Extension Service had a major beneficial effect on me.
This video will be available on our website, extension100years.net, on our YouTube site, and we also have the raw files so that if you want to use them in your states, they are available. That was part of the sponsorship from the University of Georgia. So again, I want to thank University of Georgia for that. So now we're going to break for lunch. If you go outside, go up the stairs to the atrium and to the right. We will start back here promptly at 1:10. Thank you.